at Oxford College dinner, and they had the head of the BBC on one side and head of the civil service on the other. I mean, they agreed that the purpose of their jobs, running the government, running the BBC, was not the service of the British people, but the service of the world. Labour Party at times as well. Great tradition of, patriotic socialism, which has totally gone and totally lost. What I would regard as a caricature of the IEA position of the Thatcherite neoliberal argument, which was never about, deracinated individualism. It was never about a sort of moral laissez-faire. It was about the correct role of the state in the market.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs. My name's Tom Clougherty. I'm the Executive Director here at the IEA. And for the next hour, I'm going to be in conversation with our special guest this evening, Danny Kruger, ex-Here. Danny is the Member of Parliament for East Wiltshire. He's held that seat since 2019. He's currently a shadow defence minister. He's also managing Robert Jenrick's campaign to be the next Conservative Party leader. Like me, Danny was once Director of Research at the Centre for Policy Studies. Unlike me, he wrote speeches to David Cameron and was Political Secretary to Boris Johnson. About a year ago, he published a book, Covenant, The New Politics of Home, Neighbourhood and Nation, which is a very interesting read. Danny, welcome to the IEA.
Thank you very much.
I know we've had you before, but it was a pandemic-era sort of Zoom event. Yeah. I don't know if you've been here in person or not.
Well, I've been in this room many times.
Yes.
Okay. I don't think I've still quite this format, and nor with you, Tom. But no, the IEA is an essential part of the infrastructure of the Conservative movement, and I'm very pleased to come here. Yes, the CPS, that was a long time ago. Although I was back there again the other day as well. It does feel like things come around, doesn't it?
Good, absolutely. So I'll start. It's my statement of self-referential, but stick with me for a moment. The IEA held a panel in July, which we got so many RSVPs for, we had to move it to a larger outside venue. And it was on the future of the right. You can imagine why that was a topical subject at the time. But some people complained online that we didn't have any real conservatives on our panel. It seems a bit unfair on the current and former Conservative MPs that were there.
What did you have?
We had Jack Rankin, we had Steve Baker, we had Bartek. I think all three of them count as Conservatives. We had Steve Baker and Paul Reynolds, who I think would classify themselves as liberal or non-left. Nevertheless, the reason I bring this up is I think, Danny, had you been on that panel, no one would have complained that there weren't any real Conservatives there. Or at least those people wouldn't have complained. So the question is, how would you describe your own political philosophy? What does your conservatism mean?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's both a delightful and an appalling question. That's what I was going for that. And my book, thank you for mentioning, does try and articulate it. I mean, just to shorthand, I'd call myself a sort of a communitarian. I'm a social conservative. I believe in the ties that bind. I believe in the importance of these foundational institutions in our lives that give us meaning and make us safe and also make us free. And so that's why I talk about family, neighbourhood and nation as the essential covenantal institutions that are not contractarian. I dispute the idea that we get from Locke and Hobbes and others that we're in some sort of transactional relationship with each other whereby we've agreed in some sort of prelapsarian settlement to sign a contract by which we submit to the state in exchange for the protection of our liberty. I think that whole narrative is wrong. I think we've evolved into the society we have, and the foundations of it are our relationships. So while we are free as individuals, and freedom is a glory of humanity, and certainly the Western political model, it derives from our obligations to each other. So I suppose I'm a conservative before I'm a liberal. And so I'm on the right socially. I mean, I'm economically as free market, well, not as you guys probably, but I recognise
who is there.
I applaud the adoption and recognise its absolute centrality to our politics in the UK. And we absolutely need to get back to a recognition of the importance of the small state and low taxation, personal liberty. These things are essential. But yes, I'm a conservative first.
So I'm going to jump ahead in my planned questions, actually, because it's interesting that you bring that up and you praise the contribution of sort of the free market individualists to, I guess, the right in Britain. Your book strikes a slightly different tone, I guess, and in the acknowledgements you sort of tip the hat to lots of people who would call themselves post-liberals and who might quite aggressively reject what you might call the IEA worldview, although, of course, we have no corporate view. So I know it's very obvious who your book is speaking to and what it's arguing for. I suppose what was less clear to me is who you were against. Do you share that sort of post-liberal distaste for the liberal right, or do you think that there is more in common than divides the liberal right and the more conservative or communitarian right in Britain?
Well, I think there is a sort of correction going on within conservatism back towards the genuine truths of the creed and away from what I would regard as a caricature of the IEA position of the Thatcherite neoliberal argument, which was never about, deracinated individualism. It was never about a sort of moral laissez-faire. It was about the correct role of the state in the market. And that was it, as I understand it, rather than a broader narrative around one's identity being essentially self-made, which I think is the modern mistake. And it's a mistake that the left has adopted. And I regret that some on the right seems to think that this reflects conservatism. Because I think, as I said, conservatism is a recognition of the individual's rootedness in a tradition and in a set of understanding which were inherited. So if there's to be a rapprochement between my wing and yours, Tom, it's because you guys are understanding the error of your ways and are acknowledging that you have been in thrall to a mirage. I don't believe you actually have. I mean, I think we are. There's a sort of deliberate driving of a wedge between us, but which we contribute to because it's fun to sort of battle. But we respond to this caricature of conservatism that the left present, which is believing in free markets, in all the markets without any moral foundation. I don't think the free marketeers of the IEA ever thought that. But I do think this post-liberal idea, I think, is important, and I would urge you to make your peace with it, because I think it's part of it's the future, and I think it's important. I mean, maybe we should get into it. I think there are insights there around not so much the limits of markets, but the necessity of properly moralised markets, and the importance of the nation to our economic prosperity as well as to our security and our sense of identity. And I think Brexit and then the 2019 election reflected a yearning among the public for politics of meaning that we, on our side of politics, had forgotten how to articulate. So I do think there's the opportunity to. I mean, you certainly see it. I think it is. I think our tribe is coming together, actually, and I hope that'll continue.
It's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think that I don't know. I would not level this accusation at you, having read your book and seen some of the talks you've given around it. But I think among post-liberals more broadly, I sense a kind of tilting at windmills, in the sense that the version of individualism that they try and attack is not one that I recognise at all from an IEA perspective. I mean, I'm not sure it's actually even an accurate reflection of, say, Ayn Rand's quite pure individualism, but it certainly isn't reflective of sort of the Hayekian version of individuals embedded in a social order and evolved traditions and so on that carry immense importance and play a guiding role. And I think it'd be really interesting to dig more into those two things you raised, the idea of moralised markets and the idea of the nation and their kind of importance to the political philosophy of the right. Maybe if I just start one step back from that with a perhaps slightly more political question. So I heard you say before the election defeat for the Conservative Party this year that Conservatives really need to lean into the political realignment and they need to prioritise the voters that voted for them in 2019. So this is a two-part question, really. One, is that still your view, having gone through that election defeat and witnessed its aftermath? But But more broadly, what does the political realignment mean to you? It's something that my colleague Steve Davies has written about a lot, but I think different people will have different takes on what exactly has realigned and how.
Yeah, well, I think there has been a realignment over our politics over many years, and Brexit was the real demonstration of it, and then 2019 confirmed it. The election that we've just been through both confirms and qualifies my view there. It confirms it because we saw absolutely, without question, the extent to which the voters in 2019 had demanded something that we hadn't given them. And that was a combination of competence and delivery and all the rest of it that we all recognise from focus groups in the polling, but also the sense that they wanted their country back. They said they wanted the government. The Brexit was only a symbol and a beginning of a process of restoration of the country to the people. And the immediate problem was Brussels, but the problem standing behind it was London and the system, the established systems and the people at the top. And I think the public demanded in 2016, actually in 17 as well, certainly in 2019, that the country was restored to them and that the people in charge honoured the aspirations and the interests and the beliefs of the public. And that was absolutely, I think, clear from what just happened to us, because it was felt that we had betrayed that promise that we had implicitly made in 2019. But the sort of case for the realignment is qualified, I mean, it's confirmed by that, but it's also qualified by the fact that actually we lost voters on the other side too, for largely the same reason, which was that we just failed. We didn't deliver for the public. And yes, they correctly identified a bunch of sort of pathologies, that shouldn't exist, division, scandal, just farce in many ways. People were embarrassed by the government, and therefore they decided not to vote at all, or to go Lib Dem or Labour, as well as to reform. And I think that the general sense was we didn't deserve to be in power anymore. But I do think that is a deeper phenomenon than simply we slightly messed up and we had a couple of shambolic leadership changes.
Yeah,
I think it was a profound rejection of us as a party because we stood for this failed model. And I suppose that's the fundamental point. And that's why the realignment needs to be recognised. The economic and the social model that we inherited from Blair, we didn't correct. We were supposed to, and they've thrown us out.
All right. So inherited from Blair, the economic and the social model, what were the things that should have been corrected?
Well, on the social side, we inherited there's a political side, there's a kind of constitutional and cultural dimension to it, which is the legal reforms, the constitutional changes around from the Human Rights Act through to the Equality Act. There's two big acts that sort of bookended the Blair-Brown period in government. David Cameron, I think, had the idea that just as Tony Blair had accepted the Thatcherite economic settlement, we should accept the Blairite constitutional settlement. And it was too much like hard work to try and unpick it, and the public wouldn't understand the point, and let's just move on, and it's fine, really. And you can totally understand, especially in the midst of the crisis of 2010, the economy at the time, why he did that. It was partial modernisation, communication that he was showing that the party had changed. We accept basically a massive liberalisation of social norms and a concentration of power in the hands of judges that Blair had introduced. So those are the things that I think have really harmed the country, and we should be, when we next go into government, we should be looking again at that settlement. The social model is a combination of a dysfunctional public sector of public services, which again there were efforts to change under Blair and indeed under us, but the essential basis of very top down, very hierarchical and bureaucratic and state led services, rather than what I think is the evolving social model that we see particularly in Europe, which I think we could learn from, is around a more community led, bottom up model of delivery, particularly with an ageing population with increasing levels of long-term sickness. I think we need a better social model, and the public are pretty disenchanted, even though they desperately rely on and expect us to support the public sector, disenchanted with a public sector that doesn't work. And then the economic model, well, I mean, part of this goes back to the Thatcher and Major era, but I fundamentally think the problem lies in Gordon Brown's record of borrowing, of essentially getting the public finances out of kilter, led to the great problems that we had after the great global financial crisis, which itself then necessitated, or appeared to necessitate, a decade of money printing. So we have we have a very distorted public finances, monetary policy, which has contributed to chronic inflation and inequality and wage stagnation, all of which is manifested in our regional inequality, this deeply problematic this problem that actually is 100 years old in this country, which is extreme disparities between parts of the country. We have wider spatial inequality than any other Western nation. So so you see that problem very clearly, and the levelling up agenda was a recognition of that and an attempt to try and correct it, obviously inadequate in practice. And then coupled with the rate of migration, which is completely unsustainable and has driven wages down and increased demand, public services, strained community cohesion, which we would trace back to Blair, but I'm afraid to say we increased that problem ourselves. So those are the features of our economy which need correction, as well as all the problems that you guys worry about: productivity, investment, over taxation, over regulation, which is the challenge for the next Conservative government.
Yeah. I mean, it does seem to be one of the dynamics in this Conservative leadership race is between, and it's not a hard and fast distinction, but I think some candidates would reflect your view that basically something fundamentally is broken, both with British conservatism and also with British government, and that you need a kind of radical overhaul, something that starts from fundamentals. The other view, perhaps, is that, we were incompetent and we were scandal-ridden, became unpopular, but the same thing will probably happen to Labour. So if we if we get ourselves together, sort of do the same stuff better, in 5 years' time we have a chance. It seems to me you probably reject that view and think conservatism really has to be rethought from the bottom up.
Very much. Yes, well, thank you. And that's absolutely right. And I'm afraid I think that is the debate that's playing out in this leadership election. And it's obscured by the fact that everybody says the first thing. All the candidates are saying the first thing you said, which is we're in profound trouble. We need radical change. We can't wait for the pendulum to swing back. But I'm afraid I don't see in anyone except Jenrick a genuine commitment to the changes that are needed. But they'll save the election era. Are you Conservative Party members? If not, we can ignore the race. So yes, that is absolutely right. I think there might be a swing back, so Stepping Stones report, which is familiar.
I did notice that on the table.
It's called the Stepping Stones report from 1977, and it was written by a bunch of business people and political advisors for the Thatcher, the opposition's office. And the argument it makes, it's actually about communications as much as policy, but the starting argument is it's not enough just to win power again. We have to win with a mandate for the changes that are needed, because our time in government is going to be so difficult with the challenges from trade unions and everything else, and the dysfunctions of the economy. And there was obviously, and you can see it in the report here, there was obviously an argument at the time that it'll be okay, Labour are going to be unpopular, and also we've got North Sea oil, which will prop up the economy, and we'll just need to tinker a bit and everything will be right. And they're saying that isn't right, and we need to win with a mandate. And actually, they also argue, which I agree for our time too, it'll be easier to win if we're actually being bold and brave about the changes that are going to be needed if we win. Because the essential challenge then was trade union power. And unless the public were convinced that the trade unions could be beaten, or rather they wouldn't bring the country to a halt if the Conservatives got in and tried to tinker. If there had to be sufficient confidence in the resolution of the party, that not only would they win, but then they would have the mandate and the authority to make the changes. And I think that's what happened in 2019 as well. And I was MP, working for Boris, and when he became PM, and again, a lot of people were saying, take it easy, basically, if you remember. And his view correctly was, we are in the lead up to that election, we managed to recall, if you remember all the traumas of that time, we went into it, that election with sufficient clarity about what we were trying to achieve, and we had demonstrated, or Boris had demonstrated, sufficient boldness in his treatment of the rebels in Parliament, of the EU itself, that people believed him. They thought he would do it, and they were right. So I do think you can't be mad. We tried that. We have to be sensible, but we do have to be resolute and clear, which is why on a number of issues I admire Rob Jenrick, in spite of the sort of discomfort it induces, because he is himself quite naturally consensual. Doesn't like having a fight for its own sake. He's taken clear, strong positions, both because I think it'll help him win, but also because if he wins, he's going to have to do some stuff, and he needs to have said it in advance that he's going to do them.
So I think it's so interesting that you bring up stepping stones. It's been much discussed among free market groups and so on, ever since really it was obvious that the last Conservative government was running out of steam, and that some kind of rebirth on the right might be necessary. One of the famous parts in stepping stones is that wiring diagram. I think John Hoskins was some kind of engineer, and so it's an incredibly intricate diagram of all of the different problems in British government and the way they interconnect, and the way, therefore, you have to kind of attack them strategically and in sequence. But as you say, everything in stepping stones comes back to trade union power. That was sort of the central obstacle that era thought they had to address if they were going to succeed in everything else. Do you think that there's something else in that box that says trade union power in 1977? Like, what is sort of the central problem that a conservative or free market revolution today would have to deal with?
I think there is something we can put in that box. I don't think it's as straightforward, not to suggest the problems then were simple and they were very interconnected, as you say, but there was a clear problem there. I think the comparable thing for us to identify now is Whitehall itself. It's the British state. It's the way the systems of government inhibit both the decision making of politicians, but also the entrepreneurialism of the public and of private enterprise. And you'll be, our new version of this is perhaps this paper that's just come out in the last couple of weeks by Sam Bowman and others called Foundations, which I'm sure you guys, speaking about the fusion of conservative and libertarian politics, I think it's a very good document for that purpose. It really clearly identifies how difficult it is to do anything in this country because of the growth of well-meant but disastrous regulation. And I guess here in this place and on the right in politics, we've been saying this for years, and it gets a bit tired, and I think the public sort of shrug their shoulders a bit, but it has become so profound. So I go back to my point that Brexit was just the beginning, and I was so inspired by our victory in 2019 because at that time we weren't just saying Brexit's the answer. In fact, we were saying get Brexit done. Boris was sick and tired of Brexit, if you remember. He kept saying so. I want to get boring constitutional problem behind. We need to do it in order to liberate us from the EU, but also to move our politics on so we can concentrate on the things that matter. And the thing that mattered next, and it was actually key to the mission in 2019, was reform, Whitehall reform. And that was what was supposed to happen next. And what happened next was COVID. And in COVID, you saw momentarily, and I was very inspired by this as a local MP, and my background is in, apart from the political stuff, is in civil society, so charities and working communities. I just saw the immense opportunity to reform the social system of the UK if we properly empower local places and people and businesses and charities, churches, all the ways in which people organise themselves organically, locally, in the private sector and the social sector. And there was a moment in which that looked like that might be possible. And also, it looked like the public sector might be open to reform as well. If you remember, the NHS suddenly started actually looking for help and innovating, and they built some hospitals pretty fast, and all these things happened. But then very soon enough, the dead hand returned, and we've emerged from COVID, I think, with a more sclerotic more bureaucratic state, obviously with a much bigger state. So that's the tragedy of our time in government. What we need to do now, and this exercise, the reason I'm reading it is because I think that is the great exciting challenge for us over the next few years, is to do an exercise like that. I would put Whitehall reform as that centrepiece, but there is so much more that has to happen, including in the cultural space, because you didn't have people in elite positions in those days who were actually mad, like you do now. Who believe things that are just plainly not credible and not true, and who don't believe in our country either. There was a sort of latent patriotism even on the left in those days, and now I think we have a really malignant set of ideas that have taken root on the left. So I'm worried about our culture and our society as much as I'm about the economy and the state, and they're all interrelated.
So let's talk about this idea of the nation and its importance to any conservative resurgence. Obviously, a big manifestation of that is talk about immigration. But I sense that it's bigger than that to you. There's a broader cultural argument about nationhood that you're trying to advance.
Thanks. Yes. Well, I do think nations are the most meaningful political unit. They are the highest object of our loyalty in this world, certainly in a secular sense. There's nothing else that we should have greater commitments to. And I subscribe to the traditional Western political idea that a polis depends on the demos. A political unit depends on a people. And although there's something to be said for empires, in that they can be genuinely diverse. I mean, look at the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
We're recording, right?
That's okay. That's okay. That's okay. Well, I think that's. I mean, it's the example of the EU. It was just an imperial project. The idea was actually nations are dangerous. Nationalism is dangerous, and actually it's safer to have nations contained within unions. And you can say that to the UK. I just don't think it applies well to the EU. And I think that was a bad project. And I despite the dangers that are genuinely there in nations and nationalism and national identity, it's dangerous because it's powerful, and it's powerful because it's true that we have genuine affection for our country, or we should. That's why I worry when people in positions of authority don't. There's the great anecdote in one of David Goodhart's books about sitting between the head of the BBC at Oxford College dinner, and the head of the BBC on one side and head of the civil service on the other. And they were sort of talking across him, and they agreed that the purpose of their jobs, running the government, running the BBC, was not the service of the British people, but the service of the world. Their commitments were to mankind. And they just sort of, they happened to be based in the UK, but that wasn't their purpose. And so I think institutions need a purpose to exist, and I think if the purpose of a national institution is not the prosperity and the well-being of its citizens, we're in trouble. And I think that idea, which seems so obvious and would have been obvious to everybody in the 70s, is not obvious now. It causes disquiet and discomfort among people in senior positions, particularly on the left. So I think we have to recover the idea of the nation as a credible and honourable object of our affections and our political priorities. And migration obviously plays a huge role in that, because I think we are seeing in communities across the UK change at a pace that is uncomfortable for local communities, for local people. And I don't blame them for feeling disquiet about that. I mean, the pressure on housing and on public services and the effect on wages, I think, are the sort of instrumental problems that we need to tackle. But there is I think, a legitimate cultural concern as well that people feel.
I suppose the difficulty is navigating that line between the sort of civic nationalism that you're talking about and the dangerous variety that we do see flashes of in say the recent riots and so on. I mean, do you think that the populist right or the nationalistic right, it can in some senses be a hindrance to the kind of view of nationhood that you want to promote?
Well, certainly racists are a very bad a champion of what I'm speaking for. But, you know, the devil has no creative power. So everything bad is a perversion of something good. And obviously it's totally unacceptable the sort of behaviour we see. But we see it on a much greater scale in countries which don't have a Conservative Party that speaks for the nation. And it is very important, I think, if we're to see off the threat of the far right, which we have in this country for 100 years. Since the growth of popular politics, the early 20th century, every country in Europe except the UK has had a significant far right presence, and many still do, and many are seeing it resurgence at the moment. And we haven't, because the Conservative Party managed to convince sufficient numbers of people that it had the nation's interests at its heart. Decent, respectable people, middle class, working class, across the country, understood that the Conservative Party, and actually the Labour Party at times as well, great tradition of, patriotic socialism, which has totally gone, totally lost. But, if you think back to Attlee and his generation, the people who actually called for Churchill in 1940, those tremendous patriotic socialists. So that has been, and the Conservative Party has stood for the people of this country as well. And now we have a Labour Party which doesn't understand this point at all. It's uncomfortable with the nation. If the Conservative Party can't speak for the UK and for England and for Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, can't speak for the nations of this country, that's how we will get the far right. We will get what you see in Germany, Spain, elsewhere, which is an ugly nationalism. So if you're worried about the far right, vote Conservative.
All right, well, that's not my statement, to be clear. But nevertheless, there's a chapter in your book titled Oikism. And I'm ashamed to say I saw that and I thought it would be about kind of Jobbism or some sort of story of British decline. So it actually comes from the Greek word oikos, meaning households. And I think one of the big themes in your political thought and your writing is about the need to reorient politics around families and households. Perhaps rather than individuals, but I'm not sure that there's necessarily a kind of anti-libertarian agenda there.
No.
So much as just a different way of organising the tax system or social insurance systems and so on. But what does this oikism mean?
Well, Tommy, as a director of an economic think tank, you should know the root of the word economy is the oikos, which means household. And so the idea of the economy grew out of household management of the household. And I think it's important to remember its roots in that. And yes, I think that, certainly from a sort of libertarian small state perspective, we should really think about the household, because the way to reduce a large tax burden, reduce big government, reduce dependence, is to strengthen the family unit, as well as the wider civil society, which is the next chapter. Let's talk about the family for a bit. The thing we care about most is our families, and even those people who don't have a family or who live alone, they are essentially trying to sustain and strengthen the household, which might be a one-person household, but for most of us it's more. And for most of us it will be more if it might be single at the moment. So I think the recognition of households and of the interdependence of family economies is I think an important principle which we have lost, and partly blame it on the Thatcher reforms, because personal taxation introduced a very good thing. Don't propose to undo that, but ensuring that basically working women could keep their own money and be taxed as an individual rather than having their income accounted for as part of their husband's income. So a very important reform that was introduced. But what was supposed to accompany it, and Nigel Lawson wrote a lot about this, was people being able to transfer their personal allowance to their spouse. So if one parent or one member of the couple wasn't working, the other person could have their allowance, which is a way that most other countries operate, by the way, European, United States, to recognise the fact that people share their income and they exist as an economic unit. So the economic unit is a household, not the individual, I think, is the essential truth, even if it's necessary for government to treat people individually. How to do this? I mean, many of you might have thoughts on it. It's by no means simple, but I don't think we should let sort of Whitehall tidy-mindedness dictate the way that we treat our society. And I think we should treat our society in recognition of family obligations and particularly caring obligations. So when you have children, when you have older parents who need to be looked after, when you have dependent adults, and so many people do. I mean, it's a hidden reality. And I think it's why Ed Davey cut through a bit in the election, not just with his amusing stunts, but because he talked about carers. And I think there is a huge sort of Westminster people don't really know of it, and because they don't have a particular status in the benefit system. They don't have a lobby group, but so many people are looking after other people, whether they're disabled adults, obviously young children, or their elderly parents. And our whole system seems designed to make it harder to do that. Every bit from childcare policy to social care policy, certainly to housing. I think I say in the book, we have the smallest houses and the longest commutes in Europe. So just family life is hard. I mean, that's hard if you're travelling a long time to get to and from work, and when you get home, your house is too small. You can't have your elderly mum to come and live with you. You know, that your kids are sharing bedrooms in their teens. You know, family life is really, really hard. And I don't think it's enough for us to just talk about growth and opportunity. We need to think about how people actually want to live. And I would restore the economy of the household as much as possible.
And presumably building more would be helpful.
That would be helpful. Yeah.
To go back to foundations. Yeah. So, reading through your book, and I hope you won't mind me saying this, at the beginning, you come across rather gloomy because you list all of the things that are going wrong or could potentially be catastrophic for society and human civilization. But perhaps oddly for a social conservative, or a radical reactionary, I think you've maybe used that term as well, there seems to be some optimism about technology and modernity and the opportunities that it could present for humankind. But I think maybe this is a distinction worth drawing. You seem to want to make sure somehow that technology is servant, not master.
Yeah.
Your fear is that it becomes the master. Yeah. How do you address this issue?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, exactly. That's all correct. I am very gloomy, as a good conservative should be, but and yet I see immense potential and possibility. And if we can avoid, existential disaster, which threatens us in a multitude of ways, probably greater than ever in human history. Think about the extent and the multiplicity of threats. We could also be on the cusp of never getting everything right. We're not, I'm not a utopian. There will be no New Jerusalem yet, but the opportunity I think of that modernity offers is to realise something of that yearning that we've always had for a society which is genuinely just, genuinely equal, genuinely free, in which we are freed from drudgery. I mean, I think that, fully automated luxury communism taps into something, valid actually, which is it could be possible. Not that we should ever be free of work, but that we could be free of the sort of work that demeans. And we could be liberated into a life of purpose, and in which, human relationships are enabled to flourish well. And so, I see that. I'm an MP in Wiltshire, totally rural constituency, market towns, and you see in agri-tech, I think it was a great Brexit opportunity, by the way, the opportunity to develop both a sustainable, either ecologically, safe and beneficial farming model that also brings people back to the land, involved in all sorts of local food processing, production, exchange, in making more healthy food locally for local people, as well as exporting. I mean, the opportunities to feed the urban population of China from technologies being developed in Wiltshire is just amazing. I mean, there's a huge need. China has a chronic crisis in feeding its people, and we can help. So I think we can become prosperous and have what looks like the glory of it. So it looks like a very old-fashioned society, and yet it's enabled by technology, and it's more genuinely free than an old-fashioned society ever was. So I think we can do it. I think we can have what old Tories like me, romantic conservatives, love, but it could be made possible by by modernity, and I think there is the deal between liberalism, between the progressive idea, and conservatism. So I think it is. I think there is something tremendous within sight. We'll never quite make it, but I think we can work towards something good.
All right. Well, I don't want to sort of end on a sour note, but I do want to bring up what I think is possibly the stickiest point between the communitarians and the free marketeers, if you like. And it's one of the themes in your book around place. And I don't think anyone on the free market or individualist side would have a problem with the idea of place and nice neighbourhoods and even greater political decentralisation. So that it strikes me probably one of the reasons that Britain has these massive spatial inequalities, as you put it, is because we're also one of the most politically centralised countries around. Nevertheless, I think the real tension I see here between the two schools of thought is that for me, I think probably one of the most important ways that we can encourage or allow economic growth to recover is through just letting agglomeration effects rip. Basically by letting the most prosperous, productive parts of the country build, and suck in people from elsewhere. And I think that in a way, that's what happened in the Industrial Revolution. It happened in America as well. There was this tradition of mobility, that people would move where the work was and where the opportunity was. I think with the advent of the post-war welfare state, that kind of got frozen in place. And I mean, I do note that you're careful in the book not to reject mobility and not to say that people have to stay living where they were born and do what their fathers
tempting
did or whatever.
I did.
Tempting as it may have been.
I avoided saying that.
But I do think there's a clear distinction between probably my view of London and the southeast looking like Tokyo and half the population of Britain living here, and it being an extraordinarily productive, high-tech, pro-growth megalopolis.
Yeah.
And the kind of place-based politics that you suggest.
Okay, well put. And yes, and I recognise that tension. I mean, a few things quickly. And by the way, I'm not surprised to hear you like place, because so does everybody, but particularly free marketeers. I mean, I'm always struck by all these, global financiers who settle into Wiltshire and, buy a cloth cap and, and fancy. I mean, you're wearing some very nice knitted articles there, Tom. And
it's very kind of you to mention that.
I see some lovely tweed in the audience. So there is a natural affinity for the old and the settled, even among free marketeers.
Yeah.
And that's good. But I mean, how many people do you want to live in London? And is it literally that you would say just anybody who can come here and buy a bit of land can build there and there should be no restrictions? Or do you recognise that actually part of the reason for the success, particularly the industrial towns that you mentioned in the Victorian era, was that a combination of free markets, capital, the mobility of labour, obviously getting the people from the countryside, but also the role of civil society, which often was the same people as the capitalists, but recognising they had a responsibility to their workers and to the place of building the infrastructure, the social infrastructure, and the economic infrastructure that made it work. And, think of Birmingham, particularly the role of the municipal corporation. So there was an active state that enabled those places to be what they were. And those that, you see all this in Dickens and in Victorian writers, the differences between places where there was nothing but capital and labour, unmediated, and those places that where civil society was allowed to develop with the support of government, often private acts of parliament. But the idea that there is no role for government, I mean, I think I'm probably caricaturing your position here, but you caricature mine. So
it's all fair.
So yes, but mention of what happened in the 19th century should remind us that Britain and England were never just London. And it was only in the late 20th century that London became this absolute total magnet. I mean, it always was abnormally powerful in this country compared to other countries in their capitals, but it became absolutely. I mean, until from the post-war period until 1970s, London's population was falling. I mean, there was a great London problem. And it was thanks to Thatcher, thanks to what was done there, that it began to revive. But other, and this is where I think we have to recognise the failures of the Thatcher era and its successors, is that we didn't deindustrialise successfully. We thought, as you just said, that labour and capital would sort of find each other. That what should have happened, according to the theory, is that as land values declined in those areas, capital would come in and develop new industries, and that people would flow away to where the work was. But actually, capital didn't arrive. You just got very depressed places. So something's wrong with the theory. And what's wrong with the theory is that people are stickier than you imagine. And capital is interested in more than just cheap land values. Mm. It's interested in the wider environment in which it's investing. And people have attachments to their family and their friends and their place. So that's why, although I'm no economist, and I defer to others on industrial strategy and, to what extent we can have a sort of spatially blind in public investment policy. But I do think it is appropriate for government to think about place. And I think part of our problems has been, for the last 25 years, the Treasury hasn't. It's had a spatially blind attitude. And so I think, we've got to drive up productivity. We've got to improve wages. We've got to get investment flowing. And yes, part of that is going to be about a great, deregulation, supply side revolution that needs to happen. But I hope the result of that will not just be London reaches Cambridge and we have some huge sort of mega city in the southeast, and everywhere else continues to be really poor.
I mean, it's fair to say I probably caricatured my own position in asking that question, just to be a little bit provocative. But Danny, thank you. I mean, I think, I said before we started, what I was hoping to do was try and tease out a potential accommodation fusion between communitarians and individualists. And I don't know if we've entirely arrived at that, but I'm left feeling somewhat hopeful. I mean, I think the fact that you cited approvingly the Postliberals, the Progress Studies crowd, and the fully automated luxury communists in one interview probably speaks to a degree of kind of intellectual diversity.
Well, you might or just like a sort of pick and mix, meaninglessness.
No, but there's a common theme.
Let me try another one. The Robert Jenrick and all the candidates in one of the hustings we had with MPs were asked, "What's your economic philosophy?" And I think he put a very, very, very good case for the sort of economics he wants. I was thinking, how would I describe it? And I think there came with slightly potentially with the phrase Schumpeterian Haldanism. Okay, so Schumpeterian Haldanism is the combination of that, Schumpeterian idea that we need to have I got in trouble for saying creative destruction many years ago. So I'll say it again. We need an economy in which it is possible for success to happen. And I think we need to be brave about the sort of change that are needed, and the work you guys are doing, I think, is really important. But Haldanism, Andy Haldane, former chief economist at the Bank of England, who I think would agree with the need, in particular around driving up productivity and the need for a much more dynamic supply side, would say that growth in the future is going to come from a revived manufacturing base, high-tech, high-end manufacturing, obviously, high-wage economy that is properly distributed across the UK, that we can't rely on financial services and its attendant industries and consulting and law and so on, all in the southeast. That there will be the opportunity, if we deregulate successfully and correctly, if we get our Schumpeterianism right, then I think we can see the sorts of economic revival that is needed. But it will be one I hope and believe that is rather like the Victorians did achieve, spread out across the country, in which working people can generate a wage that sustains a family, enables them to buy a home, bring up their children, look after their elderly people, which is what we all want in our lives, and I think we can get it.
Wonderful. Schumpeterian Haldanism may be the way of the future.
Catch it.
Danny, thank you very much. Let's take some questions from the audience. Yes, the gentleman here, please.
Thank you very much for your remarks. I'd just like to go back to one of the first things you said about the Blairite constitutional inheritance. And so there are two parts of that question. One, how do you get people, and particularly young people, actually interested in these constitutional questions above more immediate concerns like the cost of living and so forth? And then secondly, when you look at the elite itself, if the Supreme Court was abolished and we had the House of Lords again as the highest court of the land, would the House of Lords in 5 years' time not share the same liberal values as the judges do today, and that indeed there'll be the same people? How do you persuade the elites that we have today that maybe they need to, adopt some different attitudes? And then just finally, a brief one about the Conservative leadership contest. It appears that most of the candidates are speaking individually at conference and not debating each other. Do we need a debate of the different candidates?
Ooh. So, thank you. How to persuade young people of the importance of the constitutional reforms that are needed? Well, I think there really is an appetite. Generalising about generations is absurd, but I think there is an appetite among young people for a sort of political discourse that isn't all about the economy. I think we need to recognise, profoundly what younger people need is the opportunities we were discussing around housing in particular, the opportunity to raise a family. So there is an economic, sort of rather transactional deal I think we need to do with the rising generation, that we will offer them those opportunities. But I also think they are part of, and you see this certainly in research and opinion polls and focus groups, that all generations, particularly younger ones, they want a sense of meaning and purpose and belonging. They want to be part of something that they're proud of. They struggle with the idea of the nation, but I think, again, that can be corrected. And actually, a lot of the younger people are profoundly patriotic. So I think there's sort of cultural constitutional reforms. No one's going to be that excited by reforms to the Supreme Court, and I'm not sure personally that is the priority. I would tackle the Human Rights Act and the Equalities Act. But I think if we are able to present a narrative of why it's the right thing to do, and why it's the progressive modern thing to do as well, it's not about turning the clock back to 1997 at all. It's about modernising the state sufficiently to do what's needed. So that, I think, is the key answer to your question. We need to modernise, which is what we should have done after 2019. And then and the elite too. I just think we need a mandate. It goes back to the point here. I think civil servants, I think public servants will recognise the power of a strong democratic mandate, and that's what we need to do. We need to use it. And then the party conferences, well, they've decided how they do it. There's a strong sense among the sort of leaders of the party leadership that we need to avoid a divisive and unedifying spectacle of Tory politicians criticising each other. So the hustings have been very, very polite. I stepped in for Rob one yesterday, and everyone was very nice to each other. We were all very nice to each other. So that's how it's going to be. They will be on stage together, I think, doing a Q&A, but I dare say they won't be too critical, I'm afraid. Be able to infer their differences.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Steve, for your remarks. Family, community, country was the strapline of the Reform Party.
I noticed. I know. They've nicked my slogan. Yeah.
And they seem to have nicked your thunder there beforehand. But I do worry that, as one of the thought formers of the Conservative Party, that you think that the mandate that will cut through with the electorate is attacking the blob. I really do worry about that, because the public, the public I observed at the Reform Party conference wants something that they can see will benefit them as the small Burkean entrepreneurs that you want to encourage across the whole country. So please, don't attack the blob. Give us an agenda for family business, family inheritance, and small company-centred growth, and align the tax regime around that and let people's creative spirits free. Please comment.
Well said. I completely agree with you, and I wasn't suggesting that an attack on the blob was the slogan that we should fight the election on. What we need to fight the election on is, when we get there, is exactly what you described, which is a plan for liberating and nurturing the foundations of our country and enabling people to live the lives they want. And there is a set of reforms that will have to be credible, that people will believe, that will help them achieve that. I always think the Blob is a sort of trivialization of the problem. It's a helpful shorthand. What I described as Whitehall being the centre of the web of the problem is because I think politically that is the case. In order to do what we need to do, we do need to reform the centre. And
can I ask how many ministries you would scrap on day one?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I would like to see. I mean, not to leap to that bait too enthusiastically. I would like to see a great sort of dismantling of much of the apparatus of the state that you see in this postal district. I mean, this area used to be a residential area, Whitehall, Westminster, sorry, and it's been taken over by the civil service in these great... Whitehall used to be just Whitehall. It used to be those buildings along Whitehall. And now it's spread out across the entirety of SW1, and these huge, great steel and glass towers all around here. Most of them empty now, of course, because civil servants are working from home. But yes, there has been an enormous growth, particularly since COVID, I'm afraid to say, and Brexit. They're delighted to take the opportunity, and then partly because obviously we were resuming some powers that had been managed in Brussels before. So there was, in a sense, an understanding, but it didn't need to grow the size of the state. Anyway, so. Yes. But I don't think that's a slogan to win the election on either. I think that's just that's a means to the end, which is the sort of dynamic economy and society that you describe.
We'll have Philip Booth at the back, and then the gentleman by the window, and then we'll come over to this side.
Yeah, with the exception of Liz Truss, Conservatives seem to have just shied away from being explicitly radical about almost anything, but particularly about matters of fiscal policy. And if ever challenged, they just sort of retreat back into a shell of, well, don't worry, nothing will happen if we implement these changes. So I'm just wondering how explicitly radical you're willing to be. You raised the question of family taxation. You can pick up papers by either Tom or myself on how to reform family taxation and move to a household basis for taxation, as you suggested, and including child tax allowances, pulling huge numbers of families out of the welfare system and the tax system, ending the discrimination against single earner families and the discrimination against family formation. Full stop. You could move in. You could do that, but making our system more like it used to be and more like the systems in Germany and France and so on. But no, are you actually willing to say, propose these things and go into an election proposing those kinds of reforms?
Philip, it was very good to see you. And let's see what happens. I mean, that is what I want to see. Let's see who wins the leadership, what they're prepared to do. I think at this stage of the cycle, we need to be talking in broad principles. I think I personally, again, speaking totally for myself, I'd like to move quicker to policy development than is the traditional model of parties in opposition who basically say nothing for as long as possible. And in the case of Labour, say nothing at all. So I would like us to be moving towards the sort of reforms we needed, partly on the grounds that we've been discussing around what happened in the 70s, and you need the mandate if you're to achieve the change. Although, I don't think Thatcher and co necessarily explained everything they would do in advance. But I mean, I think, Philip, you've heard from me that I believe in those principles, particularly around family taxation. I certainly can't speak for Robert Jenrick in this, and I don't know what the other candidates would do in that regard. I've heard Kemi Badenoch speak positively about the importance of supporting families, which is encouraging. So, I really hope that now we're in opposition, we've, had our backside kicked very, very firmly by the country. There is no point, I think, just going back to a sort of steady as she goes, all will be well, let's just sound nice sort of politics. We need to develop and the country is desperate for the profound change that are needed. And the great tragedy is that they've ended up by accident, really, because of what happened with reform and so on, with a government that is committed to the status quo. Except for a few malevolent targeted attacks on wealth creators. So I think all I can say is watch this space, Philip. I believe, and just lastly, on this place, the CPS and all the other think tanks. Guys, you have such an opportunity and a responsibility now to help. Central office is tiny, as it should be. We need to be looking outside the party anyway for the sort of ideas that are needed. There needs to be a great project now of academics, think tanks, business people, experts in all sorts of public services as well, coming together to develop the plan. And I find it very exciting, the moment we're in. I just hope we can do it. And I hope we can do it in time to convince the public to trust us again at the next election.
All right. We're starting to run short of time. Let's try and take the rest of the questions quite quickly. Maybe if we take two at a time. So the gentleman there by the window. Yeah, you, sir. Yep.
Hello. I agree with diagnosis that the Whitehall reform is the way forward. As characterised as we just cannot make decisions quickly, efficiently. Everything takes themselves time to be able to get hurt. But the last government also believe that they recognise the problem and the solution, the policies every day. Everybody says it's the incredible difficulty of actually making change happen. So it's almost like we know what we need to do, but there's just the enormous vested interest to make it very, very hard to do that. So do you really thought about how it can actually...
Can we get Will Atkinson's question as well? And then I'm sorry, you two have been very patient. We'll get you two next. Just behind you.
Thank you. And I suppose, Danny, when we were discussing the 1970s, what you can offer to a sort of future version of Stepping Stones is not only your eloquence, but an understanding of the philosophical and spiritual side of conservatism, as well as the base materialism in which we focus on usually. But I was just wondering, obviously a central part of Robert Jenrick's leadership campaign more than any others is the question of migration, the issue over which he resigned. And the great tension historically between Tory free marketeers and those who are sympathetic to them has been the migration question. And I just wonder, the sense to which you think that as much as the Tories may embrace any parts of sort of markets, of an understanding of place, that has to sort of begin fundamentally with a compromise on migration. And until the Conservative Party is willing to accept that the free market has a limit, and that limit sort of begins at the nation's borders, they won't be taken seriously on any other possible issue. And that's our great failing the last 5 years.
Well put. And
I think the delivery point applies there as well, doesn't it? Easy to say, perhaps hard to do.
Yes, well,
in both
quite.
cases.
Yes, indeed. So on the first point, I think that the challenge will be how to plan for change when, no doubt, there'll be all sorts of crises on the new government's desk. And I think it is likely that we'll be, if we come back to government in 5 years' time, we'll be doing so in the midst of some profound challenges. So I think that partly it is about proper planning, crowding in the ideas, but also the implementation, thinking about the interest groups and the sequencing of the reforms that are needed. Again, just speaking for myself, I think a key commitment that needs to be made at the outset is the need for a stronger political leadership of Whitehall itself. So we need to, if we go back into government, we need to go back in with a top layer of expert support and advice, and all armed with the plan, rather than, as Labour have clearly done, arrived and said, right, we've got these vague ideas that we'd like to do. Could you tell us how we're going to do them? I mean, it's easy because what their vague ideas were about handed back control to the central state and to the lawyers. And achieving the change in migration is going to be very challenging. I think that part of this conversation doesn't get enough airtime is skills and how we are supporting our own people to fill the jobs that are needed, and how one of the problems with the rate of migration we've had is that it's depressed investment in people and in plant, in technology, and we need to, if we are going to be reducing, as I hope we will, net migration very substantially. Partly that's about stopping the emigration of skills and often quite highly capitalised people, which is what's happening, as well as reducing the inflow of undercapitalised, unskilled people. But we need to invest significantly, or ensure there is investment in the skills of school leavers, and crucially in investment in the technology which will drive growth and productivity. I mean, it's an extraordinary fact, if it's true, that we have less automated car washing places now than we did 30 years ago. Because why bother investing in machines to wash cars when you've got basically, low wage, often undocumented labour who will do it so cheaply. So we need to invest in people and in machinery again, and that's I think the key to the challenge of reducing migration.
Very interesting. And then I'm afraid this will be the last two questions, but yes, gentleman with the pink tie and then Bartek at the front.
You've mentioned sort of migration as a key issue. What gives you confidence in Robert Jenrick coming back to him for the leadership to deliver on that, having been immigration minister at near record high levels of immigration? And if it's the civil service that's sort of got in the way, how can you be sure that in a future government you wouldn't hold responsibility for the civil service for not reducing migration?
Got it. And Bob? I think we may have run out of batteries on the microphone there, so you can just shout, just project your voice. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Danny. I very much enjoy listening to your votes. Of all the politicians that I have had the pleasure to meet, you seem to come across as a lot more philosophical and thoughtful than many of them, which I, as a wannabe philosopher myself, really appreciate. I wanted to ask you about social conservatism and about small c conservatism more generally. Here in the UK, a very common way to look at conservatism is by reference to Burke's three platoons: family, community, and church, not country, as the Reform Party might suggest. And we've talked a lot about a forward view, about households and about communitarianism, but except for maybe slightly disguised mentions, we've barely mentioned the third of them. How do you see the role of religion and of faith in the future of British politics?
Thank you. That's the best question yet.
Jenrick and Jesus to finish on, isn't it?
Yeah.
Drawing no parallels, right?
I can see what we do. So Rob was the immigration minister that inherited the system, which I'm afraid to say we as a party had brought in, the Australian points-based system that unfortunately just awarded too many points to people with low skills and who wouldn't be making a net contribution to the country, which is the only principle on which we should be admitting somebody unless there's a humanitarian justification. So he inherited a very, very broken system, as well as an illegal migration system which didn't work, plainly, as we saw with all the small boats. I absolutely think he should be standing on his record, because what he did was persuade the government, persuade his colleagues and the Prime Minister to introduce changes to the visa regime, which are only now coming into effect. And we're seeing a fall in net migration, probably around 300,000 in the next year, because of the changes that he introduced at the end of his time, by the time he left as immigration minister. The other half of what he was trying to do was to ensure we had a robust deterrent against the illegal migration of people across the Channel. And as you'll probably remember, he resigned because he couldn't persuade the PM and his colleagues, including the other candidates for leader, to introduce a system that would have worked. And I joined him in rebelling against the Rwanda bill because we felt it wouldn't work, because it didn't introduce sufficient protections against human rights claims by migrant lawyers. So I think his record as migration minister is very, very creditable to him. But it is true, I'm afraid to say, all of us who supported the last government, though we can be very proud of much of what was done, and indeed of the previous Conservative governments going back to 2010, overall we are, I'm afraid, all complicit with the problems that the country rightly objected to at the last election, and we do have to begin with a posture of humility and recognition of that. But I think alone among ministers, well, not quite, almost alone among among the senior ministers of the last government. I think Robert put his principles first and stood up for what he believed in the last analysis. And I think that's part of the message he needs to take to the country, which is that he did the right thing. So I think we have the secular state, the secular liberal state, is a glorious product of a Christian politics. And all of our freedoms, including the freedom of religion, take their rise from the inheritance that Christianity gave to Western politics. In addition to Roman law and the other inheritances of the West. So I regret it when people don't acknowledge that, and they have a narrative that somehow we fought Christianity to be free. Christianity was holding us back, and a series of heroic liberals and atheists defeated Christianity in order to bring human rights and personal freedom. I think that's not true. But we are a secular state, and it would be completely inappropriate. The foundation of our politics is freedom. We should not be trying to impose any religious worldview on anybody. I would just observe that everybody has a religious worldview. Everybody brings their metaphysics to work. You worship something, and you get your ideas of right and wrong from somewhere. And I think we are in the midst of a religious conflict in the West that it has the potential to cause and is causing great distress. And I wish I had a better name for the new religion than woke, because I think that, rather like the Blob, it's just a sort of trivializing term for I think quite a coherent worldview, actually, which is that I am God. I'm self-creating. I decide what's right and wrong, and I decide what reality is. And your obligation is to worship my idea of myself. I think that is the end of society if we let that religion become dominant. I pray for revival, but don't think it's the job of politicians to impose it.
It's not that Popper's idea of the paradox of tolerance is not the case if we need to do something, otherwise all of this will disappear.
I think it's appropriate to have some deference to the inherited culture of this country, rather than to traduce it. It doesn't mean you have to subscribe to all of its beliefs and its metaphysics. But I think if we forget where our country's institutions come from, including the law itself, then we have nothing to unite us, nothing to hold us together. And the deep instinct of selfishness and aggrandizement will lead to a terrible war of all against all, and all of the things that we think so important about the protection of the vulnerable will be lost. So I fear for where we're going